take a look at the steps for making this metallic vent. New image, 10 by 10, 300 pixel per inch. Fill a rectangular selection with middle gray. Create some cutouts. If you've got like a little louvered vent like this, you know, like the heating vents in the floor, you want them to be fairly evenly spaced. How can we control the size of these little gaps in here? Like if I took a marquee tool, I could do a click and a drag and I could select this. But if I then tried to do a click and a drag to make the next one down below, how do I know that the spacing is going to be the same? How do I know that the width is going to be the same? Let's take a look at how we can call up a guide. So I'm going to make that new 10 by 10 document, and it says fill a rectangular selection with middle gray. All right, let's make that document. So File, New. And again, just to be original, we're going to go 10 inches by 10 inches at 300 pixels per inch, and I'll hit Create. I'm going to make a marqueed selection. And it does need to be on a new transparent layer. Ultimately, we want this grate to be totally transparent in the middle there. So we're going to make a new transparent layer. And you know what? You know what I haven't been doing while I've been creating these? I haven't been naming my layers. It's never a bad idea to name your layers as you go. Anybody know how to change the name of a layer? If you double click on that name, so if I double click on layer 1, I can call this vent or grating or whatever I want to call it. There we go. Now I'm going to take this selection and I'm going to fill it with 50% gray. And then I'll deselect, Command D. Now to get the spacing down, if you go under View and choose Rulers, or Command R is the keyboard shortcut for it, and depending how you've got your Photoshop set up, they'll appear along the top and down the left side. Now the way my Photoshop is set up, my Tools panel is floating right over top of part of my rulers. So if I need to see that far up, I can just grab this little title bar and move it out of the way. Yours might not pop up in the wrong spot. But basically, if you go under View, Rulers, or the keyboard shortcut is Command R, you'll see these rulers appear around the outside of your window. And if you click in a ruler, let's say I want to work out where the edges of these vents are going to be. If you look at the PDF here, we've got an edge here, 2 edges in the center, and 1 edge down the right side, kind of defining 2 columns. Well, let's define those columns. I'm going to click inside the left-hand ruler, and I'll pull this in, and I'll say this will be the very left side of my columns here. And this will be the very right side of my columns. And then in the middle, we're going to put 2 of them, one right beside each other. And I'll pull those, one to there, and maybe one to there. Okay, this isn't going to be super accurate. If you were going for absolute supreme accuracy, you would probably measure it out. What have I got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, not quite 4. Those aren't very even. If you want to move those lines afterwards, if you grab the Move tool or hit V on the keyboard, you can hover over them and you can drag them into new spots. So that they're not completely locked down. And that'll get me the width properly. So if I take my marquee tool, notice that if I click and drag, it snaps. Notice how it locked perfectly onto the left guide there. And if I pull it a little further over, you can see it does that little snap at the end there. So that'll take care of the width. Now I know that they'll all be the same width. As far as taking care of the height, though, I could click in the top there, the top ruler, and I could pull down another guide. Maybe I want the first one to be, where are my guides at right now? I think they're centimeters. If you want to change the measurements for the guides, if you right-click inside, yeah, mine are at centimeters right now. You can choose different measurements here. Actually, I'm going to leave mine at centimeters. I'm going to make each of these little louver vents 1 centimeter high. So 6, and I'll go down to 7 there. Although I do need to take into account that there needs to be a bit of a gap in between. So maybe I'll do a 2 millimeter gap, and then another centimeter. Ooh, no, I know what I'm going to do. If you want to get rid of a guide, you can just grab it and drag it right back into the rulers, and that'll get rid of it. So I'll make it 8 millimeters, and then a 2 millimeter gap, and then 8 millimeters again, and a 2 millimeter gap. And this is, I'm just making this up. This can be whatever size you want it to be. But these guides will make it fairly easy to use that marquee tool to select and delete those little sections. If you find it snapping, like right now, take a look at what's happening on the screen here. See how it kind of snaps to that part right there. What it's doing is it's snapping to the absolute center of this document. If it's snapping and you don't want it to, if you hold down the Control key, it'll temporarily disable the snap function and let you place it a little bit more precisely. Okay, I'm regretting having used centimeters. This is making a lot more little vents than I thought, but I think it's going to look good. Yeah, I think that's all I need. All right. Oops. Don't need that bottom one there. There we go. Remember the selection tools. We talked about the most basic ones, which I guess would be the marquee tool, which in this case, I mean, what we're trying to cut out here are rectangular sections, so I guess the marquee is the best one to go with. But we also talked about how when you're making a selection, you can add to the selection at any time, or if you leave it at the default, if you click somewhere else after you have an active selection, it'll deselect. So I'm going to use the marquee tool in the add to selection mode to keep selecting all these little sections in here. So I mean, we're just kind of eyeballing it. You can imagine if you were doing something that has very precise measurements, using these rulers would let you make sure that everything is nice and accurate. Again, the nice thing about using these guides, you'll notice that when you use the marquee tool, it'll actually snap onto those little blue guides there. And once I've got a selection, I can hit delete, and that'll remove that section there. And if you want to do multiple marqueed selections, if you go to the Add to Selection icon, this little two overlapping rectangles, I could just keep selecting and not hit delete until I've got all of them selected. And when you're doing a marquee, you don't have to go from top right down to bottom left. Once I'm already over here, I can simply click on the top right and go down to the bottom left, top left, bottom right, whatever it takes. Okay, there's my vents. So I selected them all, and then just hit delete. Okay, let's take a look at giving it a bit of a lighting effect. So same sort of idea. You could do apply a lighting effect to create a gradient like this, or you could just do a bevel and emboss or whatever. Let me just show you some of the things that could be done to it. If we want to keep it fairly simple, when I have this layer selected, I could go to the effects down here, and if I choose bevel and emboss, let's take a look at what that does. For the style, if I do an inner bevel, look at what happens. If I zoom in here, it does some darkening on one side of the opening, and in theory, some lightening on the other, depending what kind of settings you've got here. If we increase the depth, the size, if you want it to be not quite so hard, you can soften the edge a little bit, give it a bit of a more rounded sort of look. And the shading here is the direction that the light is falling onto it from. So if I pull this little dot down to this side, now it looks like the light is coming from the bottom right. And you can see it kind of looks like it's lit from below. If I bring it up to the top here, it's lit from straight up above. Here it's lit from straight below. So you can play around with the angle of the lighting. You can play around with the opacity of the highlights or the shadows. If I take the opacity all the way down on the highlights, all we see is the shadows. If I take the opacity all the way down on the shadows, all we see is the highlights. So you can find the perfect blend to kind of match whatever lighting your scene is going to have. And when everything looks good, you just hit OK. And that applies the layer style. And if you want to see it without, you can just turn the eyeball off in the layers panel. You see a little eyeball beside the bevel and emboss there, and you can turn that off. And you can add other layer styles as well. If I were to double click on the word effects, I could go and I could add a drop shadow. And however many layer styles you add, you'll see that you just see them stacked up in the effects pile here. So if I wanted to see it without the drop shadow, I can turn off the eyeball on the drop shadow. If I want to see it without the bevel and emboss, I can turn off the eyeball on the bevel and emboss. And if I want to see it completely without any effects, I can turn off the eyeball beside the word effects, and that turns them all off. And depending how many layers you've got, this may start taking up a lot of space in your layer stack there. You'll notice there's a little arrow beside the letters effects there, and if you click on that arrow, it rolls up all the different layer styles so you don't see them anymore. And if you need to get to them, just click on that and it rolls it back down and you can use them. If you want to change any of them, just double click on it. If I double click the bevel and emboss, there's the bevel and emboss. If I double click on the drop shadow, there's the drop shadow. Okay, so if you want to play around with the color, make it like a brass plate or something, you can throw on like an adjustment layer. Actually, I'm going to make mine a brass vent cover. What the heck? Same sort of deal. I could go under image adjustments, hue and saturation. If I want to keep it as editable as possible though, I should probably do it with an adjustment layer. So maybe I'll throw on a hue and saturation, hit colorize because there's no color in that down below. Yeah, there's a nice brass color in there. And by clipping it to the adjustment layer, it's only going to affect the pixels in the layer itself. Like if I wanted to make this a really saturated brass color, look at what's happening to the shadow. The shadow itself is picking up that brass color. But if I clip it, if I right click and choose Create Clipping Mask, it's only going to affect the pixels in the layer. It's not going to affect the drop shadow. Although that's maybe a little bit intense. Maybe we'll bring some of that saturation down a bit. Yeah. And we'll save that into the folder.